So another event recently started in Season 11 of Diablo 4, and while this one is more simple, this being mixed with some of the new farms we have in Season 11 allows for some of the most ridiculous farms we've seen in the game's entire history, and in this video we're going to be going over how to earn ungodly amounts of gold. In fact, you can earn over like 1.5 billion gold in an hour of doing this farm right now. So if you're somebody that still needs a lot of gold, you're looking to make new builds and have to re-roll and enchant all of your gear, or if you're looking to trade to try to get some of those best in slot pieces you haven't been able to get, this gold farm is going to be much better than I think anything we've ever seen in the game's history, and that's because of one of the new dungeon affixes that actually interacts with this event now. And this is the Mother's Blessing event, and this is going to be lasting until January 20th, so you only really have a week to farm this, but this event just gives you a 35% increase to experience gains and a 50% increase to gold earned from defeating enemies, and both of these buffs are multiplicative, which is actually really important for these buffs because that's just massively increased compared to just being like an additive percentage increase. Now, when it comes to gold, Season 11 is really going to be the first season that this event is actually worthwhile to farm gold in, because usually in pretty much every other season, the amount of gold you actually get from defeating enemies has just been way too weak to actually farm. But with one of the new nightmare sigils, enemies are actually dropping insane amounts of gold, which will actually use this multiplicative gold increase. Now, to do this farm, you're going to be looking for nightmare sigils with the vile splendor nightmare affix on it. It's one of the rare affixes, and all this does is it makes all of the champion and elite packs that spawn when you go in the dungeon, so ones that are already there, not ones you spawn through like events or cursed shrines, any of the actual packs that are already there will have an affix on them that when you kill them, they drop a ridiculous amount of gold. And with this Mother's Blessing buff active, these are giving you like 10+ million gold, no matter if it's an elite pack or a champion pack. And that's every single one. That amount of gold is absolutely crazy, and especially depending on which nightmare sigil you get, you can get crazy amounts of elite packs or champion packs. More specifically, any of the nightmare sigils from Nahantu are incredibly good because those don't really have objectives in them, and they're really big, and you can just go anywhere you want in them. It's not blocked off by any objectives, so you could just go through the entire thing, clear it fully out, and you'll probably be getting a lot more packs than in a lot of the base game dungeons. And then on top of that, any dungeons that spawn in elites as the dungeon objective will also generally be worse, because any of the elites that are part of the objective of the dungeon will not have this gold affix on them. So also keep that in mind. So if there's a dungeon where you have to kill all of the anima elites and pick up all the anima, those are objective enemies, so they won't have the gold buff on them. So some of those dungeons aren't going to be as good, but this affix is actually quite easy to obtain this season, so you're not really going to have issues just having a ton of these sigils. And if you want to be the most efficient, make sure to skip any cursed shrines or cursed chests or any of the events within these dungeons. Like I mentioned, any elites spawned from any of the things I just mentioned don't have this gold affix on them. Now you can also randomly find elite or champion packs just randomly within the world that will have this affix. Seems to be a bit more rare. So I think there is still like a normal chance for these elites spawned in this way to have it, but generally I would just recommend skipping it. You're going to be much more efficient just looking for any of the elites or champions that are already within the dungeon. Now, I've done a test in a video on this earlier on in the season, and within that test, I was able to get about 324 million gold per hour. Now, this was before the Mother's Blessing buff, but if you then add in the Mother's Blessing buff, and keep in mind, it's a 50% multiplicative buff to the amount of gold enemies drop, which means these champion packs and these elite packs that have this buff will also get the multiplicative increase. You should be able to pretty consistently to get like 1.5 billion or more per hour. Now, like I mentioned, this can change pretty heavily just depending on what dungeons you're getting with these nightmare sigils. There's also some amount of randomness within these dungeons just because of how they populate the dungeon with elites or champion packs. Some dungeons you could only get a handful, some dungeons you could get like dozens of them. So there's going to be a pretty big variation depending on the dungeons you're running, but it's still going to be pretty consistent that 10 million gold or more per pack is just going to give you ungodly amounts of gold if you're looking to do this farm. Now, there are a few things that can buff this, so if you're ever in a dungeon and you get a Horadric Strong Room to randomly spawn in that dungeon, because in any Nightmare dungeon, Horadric Strong Rooms can randomly be there. If you go and do that Strong Room, it'll give you a buff to complete the rest of the normal dungeon with, and one of those buffs is a 25% increase to gold. Now, I'm not sure if this is a multiplicative or additive increase, but if you get a dungeon and you happen to come across a Horadric Strong Room and you can do it early and you get that buff, that can be quite a lot of additional gold. That is kind of random though. But on top of that, you also have the escalation sigils, and those are also obtained from Horadric Strong Rooms. Once you beat the boss at the end, has a chance to drop the escalation sigils. If you don't know what these are essentially you doing 3 nightmare dungeons back to back, and it stacks up affixes on them. Now, normally you would get the sigil, it would have the 1 affix on it. You would go and run that nightmare dungeon. At the end, it would spawn a new portal, and the next dungeon you go into would have 2 random affixes. It wouldn't always give you the same one from the first dungeon and the same for the last part, but I ran like 4 escalation sigils with Vile Splendor on them. All of those escalation sigils all had Vile Splendor in all of the additional rooms. I'm not sure if this was something that is going on during this event, or if I just got super lucky, or if this is like some bug or something going on right now, but the small amount of testing and the small amount of runs I did, which was 4, getting the Vile Splendor buff in every single one of those rooms in 4 runs is pretty crazy and pretty unlikely. So I'd definitely test out if you have some escalation sigils with Vile Splendor on them. Make sure to try those out. You could still do them, and even if this doesn't happen to be true where going into the next dungeon always gives you the Vile Splendor buff, you can just do the first section and leave and skip the rest of it. It doesn't really matter. Now, one big issue you could come across is running out of Nightmare Sigils with the Vile Splendor affix on them, but in this season, you can get such a ridiculous amount of activity keys that you shouldn't really run out of these very quickly, and if you do, there's a few things you can do to very quickly get them back, and pretty much all this is going to revolve around the seasonal content. So first off, you're going to want to get the Essence of Sin Divine Gift. You're going to want that to be purified, and you're also going to want to make sure that's leveled up. So if you don't have it leveled up, I would definitely level it up. I have videos going over how to do that, but essentially you go on normal difficulty and you go spam farm Asmodan at the seasonal area. You'll always get one shot. You could probably AFK it. That's the best way to level this up. But at max rank, Essence of Sin reads that survive world boss encounters to earn legendary activity keys and infernal compasses. The weekly cache awards activity keys, and more activity keys drop across Sanctuary. So pretty much everything you do, you get more activity keys, which Nightmare Sigils will be in that. And if you survive world boss encounters, you will get a bunch of legendary activity keys. You also want to be doing this at the Asmodan seasonal fight. So first off, if there's any world bosses up, go complete those. Those will give you crazy amount of activity keys, including tons of Nightmare Sigils. And if you have this max rank, that includes a ton of escalation sigils as well. And then when there's no world boss up and you're still looking for keys, you want to go to the seasonal Asmodan area, and you want to use the materials you get from defeating the bosses or doing the seasonal activities. So from Andariel, Duriel, or Belial. So you go defeat Asmodan, you open up one of those chests around there, and these chests will essentially randomly roll between a handful of different like sets of rewards. One of them just giving you ungodly amounts of activity keys, most of which will be Nightmare Sigils. So you just go do this Asmodan seasonal fight a few times, and you'll open up the chests, and you'll very quickly just fill up on activity keys, including a ridiculous amount of Nightmare Sigils. And with how common the Vile Splendor affix is, you'll get at minimum a handful of Nightmare Sigils with Vile Splendor on it, and then you can also destroy any of the Nightmare Sigils you don't want and craft a bunch of additional ones. So pretty much anytime you defeat a world boss or get the activity key loot from the Asmodan seasonal fight, you'll pretty much be good for at least a handful of runs using this method to get ridiculous amounts of gold. So you can very easily get as many many of these nightmare sigils as you want. And that's the entirety of this farm. This amount of gold farm in game, not trading or anything else like that, is probably the best we have seen in Diablo 4 for its entire history. And again, this is the first time that the gold portion of the Mother's Blessing buff has actually been super useful for farming gold. And that's because this gold affix on champions or elites didn't exist until season 11, and the vile splendor affix didn't exist on nightmare sigils until this season as well. So I definitely recommend using this if you plan on playing any more of this season. The amount of gold you can farm through this in just like a few hours of farming is going to give you enough gold to pretty much not have to worry about gold at all for the rest of the season. Or if you're just looking to trade with other players and try to get some really well-rolled items, this can definitely give you the gold to allow you to do that. But that's all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.